Hello everybody, I hope you're all having a wonderful day or night, whatever time it happens to be, wherever you happen to be. My name is Jay, and welcome to episode 7 of History's Hangnails, the podcast where we deep dive on bizarre events and mysteries from our past. Today's episode will consist of two very similar stories, the first of which takes us back to 1945. A solid 6.2 kilogram sphere, measuring 89 millimeters in diameter, was to be assembled at the Los Alamos Laboratory, a secret facility operated by the University of California during World War II. Refined plutonium was shipped to the laboratory from the Hanford site, a now decommissioned nuclear production complex in Washington, and an inventory document dated August 30 stated that materials for components designated HS7 and R3 were waiting in the Los Alamos metallurgy section and would be ready by September 5. The sphere consisted of 3 parts: 2 plutonium-gallium hemispheres and a ring designed to keep neutron flux, a measure of the intensity of neutron radiation determined by the rate of flow of neutrons, from shooting uncontrollably out of the joined surface between the hemispheres during implosion. The plutonium-gallium alloy stabilized what was known as the delta phase allotrope of plutonium, so it could be hot-pressed into the desired shape, an allotrope being the property of some chemicals to exist in 2 or more different forms within the same physical state. As the plutonium was found to corrode easily, the sphere was later coated with nickel. This device was dubbed the Demon Core, and was planned to be used in the construction of one of 4 nuclear bombs. The first of these bombs, named Little Boy and Fat Man, were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and would be the cause of, after much hesitation and debate, Japan's surrender to the Allies. The Demon Core was also intended for use as part of Operation Crossroads, a pair of weapon tests conducted by the United States at Bikini Atoll in mid-1946, and the first detonations of nuclear devices since those used on Japan. The core was to be assembled and kept in a state that provided only a small safety margin against extraneous factors that might increase reactivity, causing it to become supercritical, then prompt critical, a much faster rate of criticality using prompt neutrons which are ejected immediately by a nuclear fission event. These factors are not common in the environment, but are manufactured circumstances, such as the compression of the solid metallic core, which would be the method eventually used to explode the bomb it was to be a component of, the addition of more nuclear material, or provision of an external reflector, which would send the outbound neutrons back into the core. Experiments were conducted at Los Alamos, which were designed to guarantee that the core was indeed operating as intended, by arranging the aforementioned reflectors to see how many were needed to approach supercriticality. On August 21, 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian was working alone, performing neutron reflector experiments on the core, with security guard Private Robert J. Hemley seated at a desk 3 to 4 meters away. The core had been placed within a stack of neutron-reflective tungsten carbide bricks, tungsten carbide being a chemical compound containing equal parts tungsten and carbon atoms, and the addition of each new brick would push the assembly closer to criticality. These experiments were known among the scientists at Los Alamos as tickling the dragon's tail. As he attempted to stack extra bricks around the assembly, The neutron monitors nearby indicated the plutonium would go supercritical if any more reflectors were added. Darglian went to remove one of the bricks, accidentally dropping it onto the core in the process and causing it to go well into supercriticality. What followed was described as a glowing blue light emitting from the device and a wave of heat. Darglian immediately reached out and removed the fallen brick from the assembly, stating later that he noticed a tingling sensation in his hand as he did so. In that brief instant, he had received a lethal dose of 5.1 sieverts, a unit of measurement for ionizing radiation absorbed by matter or tissue. His hand soon blistered over, and after 25 days of extreme pain, he fell into a coma and eventually died from acute radiation syndrome. The security guard, Robert Hemmerly, having received a much smaller dose of ionizing radiation, survived another 33 years and died from acute myelogenous leukemia at the age of 62. Despite any safety reviews of this incident, the Demon Corps had yet to claim its last victims. On May 21, 1946, Louis Slotin, a colleague of Darglian's, along with 7 other personnel, conducted another experiment with the device at Los Alamos, attempting to verify how close they could push it to criticality by once again using neutron reflectors. Slotin was demonstrating their techniques to nuclear physicist Alvin C. Graves, who would use it in a final test before the Operation Crossroads nuclear tests scheduled to occur a month later. This time, they were attempting to reflect neutrons back at the core by slowly lowering a beryllium dome down over the construct via a thumb hole in the top. They had to ensure that the core was never fully closed in, allowing some neutrons to escape and effectively halting the progress to criticality. Approved protocol dictated that shims, small pieces of solid material slotted between objects to maintain space, were to be used to keep the beryllium segments separated in case of an error. Slotin neglected this protocol, instead using a flathead screwdriver to maintain a slight gap between the surfaces, at one point even resting the top half of the reflector on the bottom half while he held it open and rotated the screwdriver back and forth to change the distance between them. While Slotin was lowering the top reflector, the screwdriver slipped out, allowing the dome to completely close around the core. As before, there was a flash of blue light and a wave of heat across his skin. The core had become supercritical for the second time in the space of only a year. Slotin reacted quickly and flipped the beryllium dome onto the floor, but he had already received an intense burst of neutron and gamma radiation and died 9 days later from acute radiation syndrome. Slotin's body had shielded many others in the room from receiving the same dose, but Graves had to be hospitalized for weeks with severe radiation poisoning. Most of the others in the room died many years later, making it difficult to determine if this incident had any effect on their cause of death. The 2 other highest doses were received by Graves and a photographer, Dwight Smith Young, who died of aplastic anemia, a severe hematologic condition in which the body fails to reproduce blood cells, and bacterial endocarditis, an infection of the inner surface of the heart. A security guard, Private Patrick Joseph Cleary was present at the time, and though he did receive a fair dose of radiation, he was killed in action 4 years later while serving in the Korean War. After the second accident, hands-on criticality experiments were no longer carried out. Raymer Edgar Schreiber, one of the surviving physicists, eventually had a hand in designing cameras and remote-controlled machines to allow further experimentation from a distance without placing personnel in harm's way. The Demon Core was melted down later that year, and the material was recycled for use in other cores. By the mid-1950s, the world's major powers were experimenting with new types of reactors and constructing the first nuclear power plants. In Idaho, between July 1957 and July 1958, at the National Reactor Testing Station, construction began on what was to be known as Stationary Low Power Reactor No. 1, also known as the Argonne Low Power Reactor, or simply SL-1. Part of the Army nuclear power program, SL-1 was a prototype for reactors intended to provide electrical power and space heating for small, remote military facilities such as Arctic radar sites, replacing diesel generators and boilers. It was initially designed to output 3 megawatts of thermal energy, providing 200 kilowatts of electrical power and 400 kilowatts of thermal energy for space heating. The Army Reactors Branch wrote the guidelines for the project and hired the Argonne National Laboratory to design, build, and test the new reactor. All components were to be transported by air, packaged with certain measurements and weight limits in mind, be standard in nature for ease of replacement and repair, with minimal on-site construction, and at least a 3-year fuel operating lifetime from the initial loading. By August 11, 1958, the reactor was self-sustaining, becoming operational by October 24 and formally dedicated on December 2. This thermal boiling water reactor used 93.2% highly enriched uranium fuel, a type of uranium in which the composition of uranium-235 has been increased through the process of isotope separation. It operated with a natural circulation using light water as a coolant, as opposed to heavy water, in which the hydrogen-1 isotope that would make up most of the hydrogen in regular water is replaced by deuterium, one of the 2 stable isotopes of hydrogen. The water system operated at 300 pounds per square inch, equaling 2,100 kilopascals of pressure, which flowed through fuel plates made of a uranium-aluminum alloy. The plant was turned over to the Army for training and operating experience after extensive testing, with Combustion Engineering Incorporated, a multinational American-based engineering firm that developed nuclear steam supply power systems, acting as the lead contractor from February 5, 1959. The primary plant operators, eventually known as cadre, were to be selected from the Army and trained in the Army Reactor Training Program. Many maritime civilians also trained here, along with some Air Force and Navy personnel. While plant operation was generally carried out by the cadre in 2 main crews, development of the reactor had been supervised directly by CEI staff. The company decided to perform extra development work on the reactor as recent as the latter half of 1960, during which the reactor was to be operated at 4.7 megawatts for a condenser test. As the reactor core aged and boron-neutron poison strips used to absorb neutrons and lower reactivity corroded and flaked off, CEI calculated that about 18% of the boron in the core had been lost. Often also used for reducing reactivity as well as radioactive shielding, in its crystalline form, boron appears as a dark, lustrous metalloid, and in its amorphous form, as a brown powder. On November 11, 1960, the CEI installed cadmium sheets, also used as a neutron poison, to increase the reactor shutdown margin. Most of the plant's equipment was housed in a cylindrical reactor building known as ARA 602. The building measured 11.7 meters in diameter, with a height of 15 meters, and was constructed of plate steel. Access to the building was provided by an ordinary door through an enclosed exterior stairwell running from ARA 603, also known as the Support Facilities Building. The reactor core structure was built to hold 59 fuel assemblies, one startup neutron source assembly used for stable and reliable initiation of nuclear chain reactions, and 9 control rods. Control rods within nuclear reactors are primarily used to regulate the rate of fission reactions by absorbing excess neutrons released by the U-235 atoms and maintaining a steady rate of neutrons allowed to cause new fission events. The 5 active rods were arranged in a cross shape, with the remaining 4 around the periphery. They were made of 1.5mm thick cadmium, clad with 2mm of aluminum, with an overall span of 36 centimeters and an effective length of 81 centimeters. Each fuel assembly was composed of 9 fuel plates, with each of these plates consisting of 1.3mm of uranium-aluminum alloy and another 0.89mm of aluminum cladding. There were also efforts made to minimize the size of the core and the number of components used, speculated to increase reactivity. On January 3, 1961, SL-1 was being prepared for restart after an 11-day shutdown over the Christmas holidays. The primary crews had gone home, and a secondary maintenance crew of 3 operators took over at the facility. Maintenance procedures required that Rod 9 be manually withdrawn approximately 10 centimeters in order to reconnect it to its drive mechanism. The rod was instead withdrawn 51 centimeters. The removal of this rod past the safe limit caused the reactor to achieve prompt criticality. Just 4 milliseconds later, enough heat was generated in the surrounding water to cause it to vaporize. This released an extremely concentrated burst of steam, striking the top of the reactor vessel with a peak pressure of 69,000 kilopascals, and causing the entire housing, weighing approximately 11,973 kilograms, to be propelled upward at 8.2 meters per second. The shield plugs were ejected at 26 meters per second, and high-pressure water and steam sprayed the entire room with radioactive debris from the damaged core. The excursion, steam explosion, and vessel movement all occurred in the space of around 2 to 4 seconds. The spray of water and steam knocked 2 operators onto the floor, killing one and severely injuring another. The number 7 shield plug from the top of the reactor vessel impaled the third man through his groin and exited his shoulder, pinning him to the ceiling. It was later established by author Todd Tucker that Burns, the reactor operator, had lifted the rod and caused the excursion. Legg, the shift supervisor, was standing on top of the reactor vessel and was impaled and pinned to the ceiling, with McKinley being knocked down by the pressure blast. Only he was found alive, unconscious and in deep shock. Autopsies suggested that Burns and Legg had died instantly, while McKinley showed signs of diffuse bleeding within his scalp, indicating he survived about 2 hours before succumbing to his wounds. Early press reports speculated that the explosion may have been due to a chemical reaction, but this was soon ruled out. SL-1 was built with a main central control rod that could produce a very large excess of reactivity if completely removed. This was, in part, a result of the decision to load only 40 of the 59 assemblies with nuclear fuel, thus making the prototype reactor core more active towards the center. In normal operation, control rods are only withdrawn far enough to generate sufficient reactivity for a sustained nuclear reaction and power generation. In this instance, however, the additional reactivity was enough to send the reactor into prompt criticality so quickly that the heat from the fuel could not permeate the aluminum cladding, which would have boiled enough water to fully stop the power growth in all parts of the core. Post-accident investigations also concluded that the control method occurred by means of catastrophic core disassembly, destructive melting, vaporization, and consequent conventional explosive expansion in the parts of the reactor core where the greatest amount of heat was being produced. In a reactor built to operate at 3 to 4.7 megawatts, the power levels reached a peak of approximately 20 gigawatts. This criticality event is estimated to have produced around 133 megajoules of energy, the equivalent of 32 kilograms of TNT. Experiments were later conducted with an identically weighted rod to determine whether it was possible for 1 or 2 men to have withdrawn Rod 9 to the extent they supposedly did. One scenario simulated possible sticking of the rod, considered by investigators to be the most likely explanation. At SL-1, control rods would sometimes get stuck in the rod channel. Numerous procedures had been conducted to evaluate the rods and ensure they were operating properly, including withdrawal of the rods to exercise them outside of the normal operating procedures. From February 1959 to November 1960, there were 40 cases of a stuck control rod during testing, about a 2.5% failure rate. From November to December, there was a dramatic increase in stuck rods, with 23 in that time period alone, and a 13% failure rate. Control rods sticking has been attributed to misalignment, corrosion product buildup, bearing wear, clutch wear, and drive mechanism seal wear. Many of the failure modes that caused a stuck rod during tests would apply only to a movement performed by the control rod drive mechanism, rather than manual handling, with Rod 9 having the best operational performance. the accident caused SL-1's design to be abandoned, and future reactors to be designed so that removal of a single control rod could not produce excess reactivity. The documentation and procedures required for operating nuclear reactors expanded substantially and became far more formal. Procedures that had previously taken up 2 pages now took up hundreds. Many radiation surveys and cleanup expeditions of the original site and surrounding area had been performed in the years since the SL-1 incident. The remains of the reactor were buried over the course of 3 excavations, in which a total of 2,800 cubic meters of contaminated material was deposited. And that concludes the stories of the Demon Core and SL-1. Events that have left a cautionary reminder of what can happen when we let hubris take over and ignore the mistakes of the past. Don't forget, I stream 4 days a week over at twitch.tv/Jayborwocky, that's JAYBBERWOCKY. You can also show your support and help out the podcast by heading to patreon.com/Jayborwocky and signing up for one of the member tiers listed. Make sure to keep a weather eye out for announcements regarding future episodes. @HangnailPod is the official Twitter for the podcast, and all announcements will appear there. Thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you next time.